You know,
All right. Budget Advisory Commission, I think we can call the meeting to order. So,
we might have somebody on the phone.
do we have anyone who's called in?
This is Caitlin on the phone.
Oh, hi, Caitlin.
I'm also on the phone. This is Lindy.
Lindy, thank you. And anyone else?
I think Tasha said she may call in, but
Okay.
I haven't heard from her.
So we have a lot of guests today. Could we quickly have folks introduce themselves in the audience, starting this end?
Carolyn Hall.
Scott Jensen.
I'm Dan Moore, City Treasurer.
Amanda Moser, Anchorage Tax Secretary. Tiffany Hall, Recover Alaska. Dan Raleigh with Nickelback.
Marcy with Treasurer.
Sarah Oates, Alaska Chart.
Brandon High, Sunny Lake, Finance.
Jessica.
Felix Rivera, Anchorage Assembly.
Awesome, thanks, guys. Good to have all of you today. Do we have if everyone's had a chance to look at the agenda, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
Move to approve.
Second.
Right, any opposition? Right, excellent. So our session today is a special work session of the Budget Advisory Commission. We're dedicating it to a discussion of revenue options for the municipality of Anchorage because there are several ideas that have been floated out there. So we've got two presentations today, one from Mr. Bockenstead with the Mayor's Office, Deputy Chief of Staff, and another with Moira Gallagher, who's been leading the Project 20 initiative. I think that we can kick it off and hand things over to Mr. Bockenstead if he'd like to present on the administration's perspective on this.
Sure. Thanks for allowing me this opportunity. This is going to be the same presentation that I gave to the Assembly 2 months ago now, roughly. At that time, the Assembly had asked us to essentially pull together information on different revenue options that the Assembly could consider. As part of that presentation, we had been putting together the budget and had been experiencing the same issue that we have every year, which is why are we having so difficult of a time balancing this without having to make some very difficult decisions. When we feel on a year-to-year basis, we're kind of doing the same exact thing, but every single year we seem to be going, man, we're short $10 million. How are we going to come up with this? So we kind of went through, and this is kind of what I'm going to kind of lay out, talk a little bit about the budget, talk about the problems, and then go through some of the options that are out there that folks know about. So some of this is going to be old news, but I think it kind of still all plays together, which is, we proposed a budget, roughly about $530 million. And one of the things that I did for the Assembly is kind of look through kind of where does the money in our budget go to? And as you can see, we have police, fire, debt service, and maintenance and operations. Just those four areas account for almost 60% of our total budget, and we can't even play with the debt service side. So 60% of our budget, or 50% of our budget goes to just three departments. Where does the rest go? So the next three largest departments, and again, our three largest account for 50%. Our next largest three account for roughly 12%. So that's how big of a gap there is, in our departments. And then when you look at what the remaining departments look like, the remaining 21 different departments account for 28%. And within all of these, there's sometimes very little room for us to do anything with in terms of cuts. There are contractual obligations or the debt services I talked about, or depreciation, or things like that. So when you look at it, what we have the ability to deal with is actually much smaller than this. So, what was the problem that we came up with? And the biggest one is obviously, I think, something that everyone's aware of, which is the state budget issues that they are facing. And not long ago, Bill Falsey was doing a presentation and looking into some stuff from the past, and he came across some information from the mid '80s. And it's basically, in 1982, so in the mid-'80s, going up, the state provided almost 45% of the municipality's budget. So, what do they do this year? Less than 1%. So, in 30 years, they went from providing 45% of the municipality's budget to less than 1%. This year, so 1.5% when you include the federal revenues that we receive. And as we were thinking about all of this, we said, "Well, where's the missing revenue coming from?" And there's kind of 3 or 4 different areas that the 3 or 4 largest ones that I'll kind of talk about. Many of you probably know about community assistance. It's basically funding to provide vital services that we receive from the state. 2006, the municipality received almost $23 million. This year, $4.5 million, a decrease of almost $18 million, about 80%. That just in the last 12 years has just kind of disappeared. And as I talk about all of these things, almost all of these revenues that we are missing are above the tax cap items. So, we have no other ability to replace that revenue unless we institute some new revenue on the municipality level. So, $18 million that is missing just from the community assistance program. Another one that I'll talk a little bit about is the veto of the school bond debt reimbursement. If you remember, the legislature cut 50%, which means that we, the municipality, are going to be responsible for a little over $20 million. And there's been some updates since then. Basically, the school district has found some additional revenue, or they didn't use some from last year. So it looks like the total amount for this year that we're going to be responsible for is $16.5 million, which is going to result in an estimated property tax increase of $48 per $100,000 in assessed value. But as you can see, we still have 20 years of school bond debt that, if we just take half of it, is going to be significant property tax increases, which for us is it's 20 years of uncertainty, and some of these bonds go back to the mid-'90s when voters passed it. Like, we are going in eyes wide open now. The state has said we're not going to provide any school bond debt reimbursement for any bonds that you approve now. Fine, we're going in eyes wide open. Here, this was a promise over 25 years that they made, that they said that they would be there, and they're not. So the state capital budget, this is going to be a big one. As you can see, between the years 2005 and 2014, the municipality received almost $855 million in state capital budgets, for an average about $85 million a year. In the last 4.5 years, we've received $22 million. The mayor can name all 3 of the grants that we have received. We received $20 million for the port. We received $2 million for some police services. And this year we received roughly almost $500,000 to maintain some streetlights on Jewel Lake Road. That is it. So what does that look like? That's a decrease of 94% almost. And as I'll go through here in a second, you can kind of, so this is state legislative grants, and you can kind of see 2013, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. The count is the number of grants, number of projects. So going back then, we had 600 projects and a balance of 300 to almost $400 million. This year, we're down to 121 projects and only $125 million balance. And I will say that the $125 million, the vast majority of that, I believe almost $80 million of that, is just the port. So there's very little funding on the state capital budget side. It's pretty much gone. So the only game in town on the capital side is the municipality when we go through our bonding every single year. So one of the things, though, that I wanted to just kind of highlight, and I did for the assembly, was some of the projects that were actually funded all around town. So Yosemite Drive in Eagle River, Dubin Street over in East Anchorage, the Girdwood Fire Department renovation, the South Anchorage Sports Park, Arlberg Avenue, Cordova Street, Pioneer Drive, the Chugiak Fire Department replacement, Sullivan Arena upgrades, Diamond Boulevard upgrades, Eagle River traffic mitigation, and the Port of Alaska. So, these are projects that are all across town that, similar projects now going forward are just going to be sitting there and deteriorating more because we just don't have, the municipality doesn't have the ability to fund projects, on this scale every single year. We do about $30 to $40 million in our road bond every year, and about half of that is going towards design for future projects. So about $20 million every year that we are able to bond for actual construction projects. So, with all that being said, here are some of the options that I think, for the most part, most of the community knows about, but we'll run through them anyways. The first one is the bed tax, the current structure. Back in 2005, the voters approved a 4% increase up to 12% to help build the Janina Convention Center. 1/3 would go towards the promotion of the tourism industry, 1/3 to financing our Anchorage convention centers, and 1/3 to general government. So what does that look like this year, or in our budget? About $11 million for tourism, $11 million for the convention centers, and $11 million for the municipality. So, as I go through all of these, just one of the things that I will show, what we did just to provide ease in showing the numbers is we just picked 2% on all of these. So this is what a 2% increase in the bed tax will look like. When we go to sales tax, it's what a 2% sales tax will look like. It's what a 2% alcohol tax will look like, and it's what a 2% payroll tax. Just so that the numbers are all the same. Essentially, 2% increase on the bed tax would raise roughly an additional $5.5 million for the municipality. When I talk about diversification of revenue, one of the things which we've talked about is potentially on any new revenue measure, it'd be a 50-50 split, so 50% would go towards property tax relief, 50% would go towards for general government expenditures. So when you look at that, sure.
Like I said, you're saying half of the $5.6 million would be property tax relief, and half would be new.
Correct. That's just in this presentation as we're talking about it. I think some of it is up to what the assembly would ultimately like to do on some of these, but we wanted to provide what that would look like if you did do 50% for property tax relief, 50% for general government.
Because the worry I have is it seems like it's kind of peanuts for new revenue then, and it's peanuts for property tax relief, so it doesn't really feel like much of a win. Anyway, sorry.
Just for exposure to what it looks like, and I think we would agree on some of these. It's not a lot of revenue either way. As we get into some of the larger ones, the sales tax and the payroll tax, I think you'll see that there is significant revenue, and there would be a significant property tax relief to that. But for this one, as you see, it's about $8 per $100,000. when we talk about the number of employees, how many employees would the municipality have to bring on to implement this? And because we already have folks that work on the bed tax, we actually would need no additional employees for this. And again, because it's already there, it's relatively easy or quick to increase and start receiving it. So all of this is, if the voters approve something in April, when would we be able to implement it? So on a bed tax, if the voters approved it in April, we would put it into effect in July 1 of 2020. And on some of these, we go through and are they deductible on your taxes? This is dependent on the buyer for this one. Number of payees, there's about 400 that pay into it. The national average is 14%, so we're at 12%, so we're actually below the national average when it comes to the bed tax. And then in terms of who pays, roughly 10 to 15% of the residents here in Anchorage pay the bed tax. Business is NA, but they'll come in both of these a little bit. But essentially, visitors, tourists, and commuters pay 85 to 90% of the bed tax. So going on to the alcohol tax, again, 2%. What would that equate to? About a little over $5 million. And again, $8 per 100,000 if you did half to property tax relief. Again, because this is a new tax, Treasury estimates that they need to hire 3 additional employees to be able to implement and oversee this throughout the year. Implementation date, a little bit farther out, you'd be looking at January 1 of 21 if voters approve something in April. And again, depending on the buyer, if it's deductible on your taxes. Number of payees, about 450. National average, couldn't really find one. I mean, there's places that have, a general sales tax that taxes alcohol, but there's a lot of other places that have an independent one, and there are a lot here in Alaska that have an alcohol tax as well. So, who pays? Roughly residents, 85 to 90% of residents, and visitors and tourists pay the remaining about 10 to 15%. And that's just an estimate from our Treasury Department. So sales tax, what does that look like? 2% on a sales tax, and this is with the kind of the reasonable deductions that most people think of as you go through here. I think the one big thing, and I'd have to get Dan or Eric to confirm, but I think the one big thing that could move this up or down is I think this one had a cap at $200. So depending on if you remove the cap on purchases above $200, there's no additional sales tax. So if you remove that, this number could go up or down quite a bit. But 2% with reasonable deductions, about $73 million. So that is significant. If you do 50% property tax relief, that equates to about $107 per $100,000. Number of employees, we'd need to hire 25 to 30 employees to be able to implement this, and as we go through this, you'll see why. And again, because of things we'll talk about, you're looking at roughly 2 years to be able to implement this and get it up and running. So we'd be looking, again, if voters approved in April, we'd be looking at April of 2022 before it was ready to be implemented. Again, taxes dependent on the buyer. So a number of payees, there's thousands. So that's why it's going to take so long, because you have to go into work with every single entity that would be required to pay. So that equates to both how long it would take to set up and then the number of employees that we would need. The national average is about 6%. Residents pay about 40 to 60% of it. Businesses pay 30 to 40%, and visitors and tourists, commuters pay about 10 to 20%. So it's split among all of those. The final one that we have kind of explored and talked about is a payroll tax, and this is essentially just a tax on a business's payroll at 2%, brings in about $78 million. And I believe, Dane, correct me if I'm wrong, this excluded any business that had under 50 employees.
Correct.
And then potentially, were there other businesses that were excluded, or just the under 50?
I don't think in this estimate we were specifying any others. It was more just for the number of employees. Yeah, you can't tax government employees.
Yeah, so any business that had under 50 employees were exempted, and also government were exempted because we can't tax them. And again, there's significant property tax relief if you do a 50-50 split here, $114 per 100,000. Number of employees, there would only need to be 3 to 5 employees to implement something like this. And again, you'd be able to implement this a lot quicker. Essentially, January of 2021 would be a start date for this one. And is it deductible on your taxes? That is a yes. So, number of payees, we have roughly 500 businesses here in Anchorage that would qualify with over 50 employees. So, resident zero, this is 100% paid by the business, so no one else would pay it. And then the final option that has been kicking around for a number of years is one that we don't have any control over on the municipality level. This would have to be implemented at the state level, but it's community dividend. And there's a couple of different ways that we have thought about this. One is essentially, I think, exactly how Wally Hickel thought of it, which is you just create a community dividend fund. You fund it with roughly $2 billion. You pay out about 4.25% every year, which would equate to about $85 million. And what would the MOA share be? It would all be formula driven, but just to give you a little perspective on this, this year when we received $4.5 million, essentially the community assistance program amount that was paid out statewide was $30 million. So, if they used the same exact formula but went to something like this, you'd think maybe the municipality would get about 3 times what we got this year. So about maybe $15 million. The other idea that AML, the Alaska Municipal League, actually just, I believe, voted on and their members supported, so they'll be lobbying more on this this year, is creating an Alaska Municipal Services dividend. And the way that this would work is a couple of years ago, the legislature switched to kind of the POMD model, where 50% of the revenue that spun off from the permanent fund would go towards funding state government and 50% for dividends. This would change that a little bit and do a 40-40-20 split, so 40% to dividends, 40% to state government, and 20% to this. And essentially the payout would be 20%, but that would equate to $585 million a year that would be able to go towards municipalities across the state. And again, it's formula driven, but I'm going to go through a couple of ways that AML has thought about how to potentially break this up every single year. Essentially, the components would include $100 million that would go towards for municipalities to do school bond debt. So that'd either be paying off old debt, or as we move forward, a share of new school bond debt. $40 million for a Port and Harbor Capital Fund that ports would be able to draw on every single year for work around the state. Community assistance, that's essentially what we have now, and that there'd still be a tiny amount given to this that would be said, hey, municipalities, you can use this on whatever you want, however you see fit within your budget. Road and rural airport maintenance, $100 million. So basically, because this would be used essentially as the state capital budget. Law enforcement, so folks around the state would have $80 million. Municipalities would be able to figure out how do they want to spend that within their law enforcement budget. And then $75 million for deferred building and or K-12 maintenance. And then finally, the senior citizen property tax exemption reimbursement. So that is one idea that I think is going to gain a lot more traction this year. This would significantly change the ball game, I think, for a lot of municipalities. for us, we'd be much more likely to be able to sit down with the state and say, okay, what responsibilities do you want us to take on so that you can cut your budget, instead of, I think, how it has been, which is just cut your budget and you guys figure out what you guys are going to do, which, in most of the time results in just less service on any given thing. But with something like this, I think we'd be able to sit down with the state and go, okay, you want us to plow all the roads in Anchorage? Great, we'll do that. You can cut your budget. We'll increase ours to make up that difference. And there's a whole host of other items that we'd be willing to do that with them on if we had something like this. So with that, I'll either turn it over to the next person or answer any questions or wait until the end.
Questions do folks have?
Let me just make a point, I think, for members of the committee, members of the audience, that this special work session is really just about information sharing. So they don't have on their agenda as an action item to approve or adopt any one of these things, but it's really for the Budget Advisory Commission to sort of catch up on the information that's been shared in other places, so get it all at one place. So I think, at some point, the Budget Advisory Commission from the administration and the Assembly has asked these Budget Advisory Commission to sort of weigh in on these things at some point in the future, but the purpose of today is just to get the commission caught up on the activities and conversations that have happened to date. So just as a reminder to the commission and for the benefit of the members attending today.
And although we didn't put public participation on our agenda, I would like to, because we've got so many guests, I would like to open it up at the end to public comment. So it might be limited. We may not have a lot of time for it, but I would like to attempt to do that. So no questions then? Or Carla, go ahead.
You might be about to cover it, or you might cover it in the slide, particularly sales. Did you have in there the cost of all the new staff that you?
I believe it's about $3 million.
It's north of $3 million
Per year to
Per year.
to
There's
have.
also there's something $7 million of just startup costs. So yeah.
Okay.
Chair, and maybe I missed it, but how is the community dividend initially funded, that $2 million?
Well, I mean, I think part of how we've always thought about it is that's somewhat up to the legislature and the governor to essentially, say, hey, we're going to take $2 billion from, one of the funds that is out there and just create a new community dividend fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming from the permanent fund was probably the original idea. Right?
Correct.
Yeah. Carla?
I have, sorry, through the chair, I have another question. On the payroll taxes, do you know if the Valley has anything similar?
No, I think we would be the first one in the state to have a payroll
Right.
tax.
And that would be something that would worry me, I guess, is the Valley is growing by leaps and bounds, and for businesses to take their business elsewhere, if they can go right outside of borough limits and put their businesses out there. Okay. And then on the $2 billion that we were just talking about, the revenue is I know you mentioned it, but I think you said there was going to be like an $85 million payout on the.
Yeah, if you pay out about 4.25% every
Okay.
year on that.
And you're pretty confident about the 4%? Okay.
I mean, I think that's. Again, that would be up to the legislature, but that's what we pay out in our municipal trust fund, and it seems to be sustainable on that level.
Okay. Anyone else? Then next up, we've got Moira Gallagher to talk about Project 20. And we've got a presentation, I think, right?
Yes. Just plug in here. What's at the top?
I think it's right here.
That's
It's either, maybe it's that one, maybe?
I think it's the top.
This one up here, maybe?
Oh, forget that.
Need some transition music.
Yeah, anybody want to chime in with some Christmas carols or something? Well, thanks so much for having me here today. My name is Moira Gallagher, and I'm the campaign director for the Project 20s initiative. I'm a lifelong Alaskan. I was born and raised here. I am just old enough to remember Project 80s, and I grew up in an era where so many of the facilities in Anchorage, so much of our infrastructure was brand new because of the investments that we made as a city through Project 80s. And one of the big reasons why I am the director of this campaign is because I'm really passionate about continuing to have a city that attracts and retains talented people, that is a safe and livable community to raise families. And we are, as a community, we're really at an inflection point. I'm grateful to Jason for the presentation he just gave in showing our financial challenges that have come through a number of reasons. The state pulling back, obviously, decline in oil revenues, decline in federal money coming to Alaska. And it really feels like it's time for us as Alaskans here in Anchorage to roll up our sleeves and take a little bit of responsibility to be more self-sufficient, because that outside money, that other people's money that we have always loved, and that is, of course, the best kind of money, is dwindling, and it's also a very unsustainable way to plan a city. So we're at this really critical inflection point, and it's particularly critical for businesses. Anchorage is competing with every city in the world to attract talent. And the reason why that's important is because businesses that locate in Anchorage locate here because they have access to talent. And they relocate when they don't have access to that talent. I would be happy to give you actually dozens of examples of small companies I know that started up in Anchorage, and as they grew, there was demand for their services in Anchorage, but they couldn't find the kinds of highly talented workforce that they needed, and they relocated to the lower 48. They still deliver services to Alaskan clients, but they're taking all of that revenue now out of state, and they're creating jobs out of state. The cities that are experiencing real economic growth, tangible, sustainable economic growth, are the ones that are successful at attracting talented professionals, because companies can be located anywhere in the world, and they're going to choose to be located in places where they have that workforce. We're losing this competition, and it's not just to major metropolitan areas like San Francisco or New York. We're losing this competition to other mid-sized cities that have similar economic, similar climate profiles. And if we don't succeed, I mean, really, in the very near term, if we don't turn around and become a city that attracts and retains our best and brightest, then we're going to fail to diversify and grow our economy. This is an urgent issue. It's urgent that we find ways to not only be self-sufficient financially, but also make our community a place that keeps young families here, that attracts professionals, and more importantly, attracts new investment as we look to the next 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. If we look at what that competition for talent looks like, this is just a very, just one way to slice this data, but I think it's really interesting to see which cities are seeing substantial population growth in residents aged 25 to 34. These are people who are right out of college, potentially. These are people who are really quite mobile, usually people who don't have children yet, so they're looking for places where they want to live. The city that should really stand out to you here is Boise, Idaho. You know, this is not New York City. This is not the Bright Lights big city, but 19.9% population growth of this mid-millennial cohort over this 5-year period, 2013 to 2017. You can also see Portland, not surprisingly, 10% increase. Asheville, North Carolina, which has become a real cultural hub of the South. Madison, Wisconsin, a beautiful college town, also a winter city. And Oklahoma City, which I'll talk about here shortly, despite the fact that Oklahoma City is also a resource extraction dependent community as we are, and has seen declining tax revenues because of the declining value of oil, they have continued to see 2.4% growth over this 5-year period of those mid-millennials still coming to Oklahoma City, still seeing this as a city of opportunity. We'll look really quickly at Boise and what Boise has done to be the city with 20% growth of young professionals. Well, they started about 25 years ago. This didn't happen overnight. They started by making major public investments in what are called complete streets in their downtown area in particular, investing in walkability and bikeability year-round, public art, and outdoor recreation infrastructure. They also created a lot of incentives for development downtown because they know that one of the things that young professionals are looking for is a vibrant downtown community where they can live and where they can have these great urban experiences. So they provided incentives for residential development, for commercial retail development to really make this a thriving area of Boise. The city is also home to a major state university, and they've continued to attract major regional tech companies through partnerships with the university. But they also have, begun having this reputation as a community that has access to an urban lifestyle, but also the outdoor recreation perks: skiing, fishing, hiking, cycling, 10 minutes from downtown. You can hop on your bike and you can be in the mountains really in 10 or 15 minutes from Boise. So that combination of urban amenities and outdoor recreation is what is attracting these millennials and young professionals to live in Boise. And a lot of those things sound familiar. A lot of those things really speak to what we have at the core of Anchorage. I want to talk a little bit more about Oklahoma City. They did a very specific initiative because about 25 years ago they realized that they were really failing to be a city that attracted new investment and attracted new talent. Oklahoma City in the mid-90s was shortlisted to be the next maintenance hub for American Airlines. Obviously, this would have been huge for Oklahoma City, a multi-billion-dollar investment, thousands of jobs, hundreds of $millions in an increased tax base. The site selectors from American Airlines came to Oklahoma City and did a whole visit. And at the end of it, they said, you've got low taxes and you've got a business-friendly regulatory environment, but we got to be honest with you, your city's a dump. And I speak to the economic development professionals in Oklahoma City all the time, and they would be the first to tell you, our city was a dump. The downtown was a ghost town. There was nothing there. We had made no major capital investments in decades. There was no real reason why you would want to live in Oklahoma City. American Airlines chose not to invest in Oklahoma City because they knew they wouldn't be able to get their employees to move there, and they wouldn't be able to attract the talented workforce they needed for a major maintenance hub. And instead, they chose Indianapolis. So this was a huge wake-up call for Oklahoma City, their Chamber of Commerce, their economic development organizations, their city. And they got together and they proposed an initiative that was called MAPS. That stands for the Metropolitan Area Projects. It's a very original name. And the proposal was a 1% sales tax that was temporary, and it would be used to exclusively fund public improvement projects. In this case, it was exclusively for their downtown. It would include a new sports stadium, this beautiful canal district that you can see in the photo, an electric trolley. If you talk to people from Oklahoma City, you should ask them about the electric trolley. They're obsessed with it. They think it's the coolest thing they've ever seen. Maybe not great for Anchorage, but Oklahoma City loves it. And they invested in housing incentives to make sure that they could get the kind of mixed-use residential development in their downtown that would be attractive to young professionals. An alliance of business associations created the list of priority funding projects for this, and they put this on the ballot, and it passed. And the great thing about this was it was a temporary tax designed to sunset as soon as they raised the amount of money they needed. They said $400 million is what they required for the list of projects. The money could not be spent on anything except that list of projects, and it automatically sunsetted after about 5 years once they hit that $400 million mark. Other really distinct components of this were that all the projects had to be forward funded. The city could take out no debt to fund them. They could not bond against future sales tax revenues. So it required some patience on the part of the public to say, we want this new sports stadium, but we have to wait until the $60 or $70 million is in the bank from the sales tax that we've been paying in order to build it. The new sports stadium is a really interesting example. They didn't have a national sports franchise at the time in Oklahoma City, and they thought, well, maybe if we build a new sports stadium, we can attract it, right? Like a classic, if we build it, they will come. And it worked. They built this beautiful new sports stadium, and they stole the Seattle Supersonics and turned them into the Oklahoma City Thunder. And they now have this incredibly thriving downtown that has sports, it has new breweries, it has restaurants, retail, boutiques, and great housing opportunities for what is now a growing demographic of young professionals. Now, after these projects were completed, they had really developed a lot of public trust. This was an incredibly transparent process. It was incredibly accountable, and they built the things they said they were going to build. So a couple years later, this same alliance of business associations came back and said, we want to do it again. This time it's a 2% sales tax, again, temporary, and exclusively to fund rehabilitations of our public schools in the district. Oklahoma City is an older city. You can imagine they have schools that are 100 years old, no air conditioning. That second version of the MAPS project passed by an 80 to 20 margin. The residents of Oklahoma City were so happy having seen the delivered results on a temporary sales tax that went away when they said it would go away, that built the things they said they were going to build, that they passed it a second time with an incredible margin. They then went back and did it a third time, and it passed with another high margin, and currently Oklahoma City is working on MAPS 4.0. So we look at places like Boise, Portland, Asheville, Oklahoma City. What do these cities have in common? Well, first and foremost, they are making major public investments in a sense of place. They also have support and interconnection with their public universities. Most of these are cities that have public universities within them. They have vibrancy, arts, culture, and housing downtown with robust transportation options. Downtown is so critical because it is the face that is presented to the world. It is the first thing that people see when they come to your city, whether they're coming as visitors or they're seeing if they might want to move there. Everybody checks out your downtown first. Having great access to downtown and the ability to get around downtown easily with lots to do is critical. And they have easily accessible outdoor recreation opportunities, which Anchorage does as well. So there are a lot of ways in which we've got the raw ingredients here, but we need to be making those public investments to make it easier to access. The last time Anchorage made major public investments were in Project 80s. And for those who may not be familiar, Project 80s was the idea originated in the mid to late 1970s. The city leadership at the time saw that we had a lot of oil money coming in, of course, free money, manna from heaven, and that we needed to make critical investments in infrastructure in order to modernize as a city and take the next step. The Project 80s capital projects were the Performing Arts Center, the Sullivan Arena, the museum, the Egan Center, and a number of others. There were 7 facilities that were on the original Project 80s list. Since then, the only major public investment we've done similar to that is the Denina Center, which was a one-off, and as Jason pointed out, was paid for with an increase in the bed tax. But a lot of these facilities and a lot of this infrastructure is aging, and it's sad to be a city that hasn't made major investments in itself for nearly 40 years. If you owned a business, you wouldn't treat your business that way. You wouldn't look around and say, I think we're good, let's continue to let things deteriorate and not actually modernize or improve or innovate and just rest on the things that we already have. We're really low on public investment in Anchorage. You may hear people talk about how high the tax burden is in Anchorage. That's a very inaccurate picture. This is from a list of the largest city in all 50 states. This is the average tax burden for a household making $75,000 a year. Now, the median household in Anchorage makes about $81,000 a year, so this is not exact, but it's pretty close. And you can see there are some communities where the tax burden is pretty extreme. I certainly am glad that I'm not living in Bridgeport or Newark. But what you can see is that most of these cities have a pretty diversified stream of public investment coming in through sales, property, income, auto tax, and miscellaneous. Anchorage, on this list of the cities, the 50 largest cities in all 50 states and DC, Anchorage comes in 51 out of 51. So the average tax burden for a household making $75,000 a year is $2,900. Now, if you were to consider the fact that people are also receiving permanent fund dividends, or, for now, the average household having maybe 3 people in it, you would actually negate that tax burden with the amount that's coming in through a permanent fund dividend. A $1,600 permanent fund dividend times even just 2 people in a household, it would mean that your tax burden here is negative. So it is really important to think about this as we think about new revenue, because Anchorage is not a community that is paying extraordinarily high taxes compared to any kind of national metric. So let's talk about Project 20s. This is based almost entirely on the model of the Oklahoma City MAPS. It's a temporary 3% sales tax to fund a dedicated set of specific capital projects that makes Anchorage a better city for doing business. Fundamentally, this is about being a community where we can attract and retain talented professionals and attract new business investment. We are not succeeding at doing that now, and that has to change. The Project 20s projects, which members of the commission you'll have on the list here on the handout, they're broken down into 3 main categories. The first, which represents about 40% of the revenue, is focused on downtown revitalization, because we know how critical downtowns are to attracting and retaining talented people, as well as attracting business. It would involve a 4th Avenue pedestrian redesign, most likely not a pedestrian-only boulevard, but making it significantly more pedestrian-friendly with wider sidewalks, with pedestrian-level lighting, with more signage, landscaping, and also emphasizing the 4th and G Arts District that already has a burgeoning following here. The second piece would be a Ship Creek redevelopment, a miniature version, or I should say a scaled down version of what was in the 2015 Ship Creek redevelopment plan, which was a little bit grandiose. But Ship Creek redevelopment along the southern edge of Ship Creek, where there are both Alaska Railroad and municipal properties that could potentially be fantastic areas for mixed-use residential, shopping, brewing district, and restaurants. A fantastic area for tourists to disembark from the train when they get back from Talkeetna or Seward and to actually enjoy something that's right there, and also something new in our downtown. The third piece of that is Winter City walkability and this Winter City infrastructure. If you look at winter cities that are really successful at creating this vibrant downtown feel, walkability is critical. Ice-free sidewalks, making sure that there is continuous shuttle service so that if you come downtown and you have to park ghastly to think about, but 4 blocks away from your destination, that there might be a transportation option for you to get there so that you don't have to walk in the cold. Also additional lighting so that downtown sidewalks feel safe. You know, we have 19 hours of darkness a lot of the days of the year, and those are days when people are not going downtown, they're not shopping at our downtown businesses, but we see other cities where that is happening because there's lighting, there are more attractions, and it feels safe and walkable. Another 40% of the revenue would go into the second category of, generally speaking, homelessness and substance abuse. First off would be a citywide trails rehabilitation to clean and clear out the trail system. Over the last 30 years, since our cross-city trails were built, we've seen a lot of a lack of maintenance and overgrowth that just wasn't part of the original design. Our trail systems were meant to have very clear sight lines of at least 30 feet, so that as you are using the trails, you're not going to be surprised by a person, or perhaps more likely a moose, jumping out at you. Right now, if you've used the trails lately, you know that there's just a wall of foliage that prevents you from being able to see into the areas besides the trail system. And you also know that there are homeless encampments that have grown up in those areas over the last decade. It contributes to a lack of safety. It contributes to a lack of usage of the trails, which, of course, is a vicious cycle. The less safe you feel, the less likely you are to use it, and so on. We can't, however, clear out homeless encampments and not give people a place to go. That is both unethical and, it turns out, illegal. So adding shelter capacity is one of the critical functions that we see needs to happen here. There need to be warm beds for people to sleep in. People who are living rough cannot be forced out of sleeping in public areas if we don't have a shelter space for them. And then the next component of this would be funding for the Alaska Center for Treatment / Cliff Row House, putting in the investments that we need to make in order to help people who are struggling with substance abuse. That is a contributing factor to homelessness. It is a contributing factor to public safety issues. And we also have some of the highest rates of substance abuse in the country. So not addressing that would be entirely irresponsible. The last piece, about 20% of the revenue, is some critical public safety projects that have been put on the back burner for way too long and that at this point have become real life-threatening issues. The hillside fire evacuation roads. In many parts of the upper hillside, roads have been built with only one-way access. If there were a fire on the hillside, just a couple of years ago, we saw with the McHugh Creek fire, you could end up with people trapped in their homes because the fire could block the road, which is the only way in or out of those neighborhoods. We need to have fire evacuation roads. We also need to improve the roads on the hillside so that fire trucks can get in and out. Some of those roads were not actually built up to the standard that would allow a fire truck to get in an emergency, especially in the wintertime. The second is the Eagle River Valley Fire Station. As residential development in the Eagle River Valley has exploded, we've seen that the response time for fire trucks in Eagle River to get to a fire in the valley is now 15 minutes or longer, which is pretty unacceptable. That's enough time that a house burns to the ground, and again, people could die. So these two we see as rising to the top of public safety issues that need to be taken care of immediately. The details, where the devil is. This 3% sales tax will raise about $75 million a year. I should get with you because our numbers don't match, but maybe mine is a little conservative. It does include many exemptions: groceries, fuel, legal and medical services, feminine hygiene products, the things that tend to make sales taxes really regressive. We've tried to exempt as much of that as possible. The tax would automatically sunset once $375 million has been raised, so this is approximately 5 years, but the reason why we use the dollar amount is because frequently revenue exceeds projections, and in that case you can actually retire the tax early. That happened in Oklahoma City, it also happened in Wasilla when they did something similar. The revenue from the sales tax will go towards administration of the tax itself, so we would dedicate about $3 million a year towards the additional employees required to administer, as well as $1 million a year to a small business assistance fund, which provides grants to small businesses of 10 employees or less to offset the costs of administering the new tax. The projects have to be forward funded. They can incur no debt. So in the Oklahoma City model, there's no bonding against the future revenues, and it all has to be saving for our future. 10% of each project budget has to go into a designated maintenance fund so that as time goes on, we actually have provided the money to maintain these facilities, a mistake that was made in Project 80s that we don't want to make again. If a project comes in under budget, the only appropriate use of the extra funding, you can't put it towards other projects, you can't put it back in the general fund, it would have to be put towards the maintenance fund again so that we can continue maintaining those projects in the long run. And all of these projects are subject to a 1% art requirement, as well as indigenous naming requirements for any new roads, parks, trails, and public spaces. So why? Why this project? Why is this the right project for Anchorage, and why right now? We haven't made major capital investments in this city since the 1980s. We have been doing a lot of patchwork fixes. Administration after administration has been really stymied by lack of additional revenue and by constantly declining state revenue to be able to make capital projects. And so as a result, as a community, we're just sort of taking care of the potholes that need to be fixed today and not looking towards our future. We have to make investments in our future. Again, just like a business, we can't just sit on the city that we have and let it continue to deteriorate around us without looking towards the kinds of modern innovation we need to be more attractive and more competitive with other communities. The temporary sales taxes that have been introduced in other communities have been extremely popular. They're significantly more popular than general sales taxes. They're significantly more popular than payroll taxes. Wasilla in 2001, I think a pretty good example of a very conservative community. They voted for a temporary 0.5% increase in their local sales tax in order to fund the Curtis Menard Memorial Sports Center. They looked around and they saw a critical capital need. They didn't have enough ice time. It's a big hockey community, and there wasn't enough space or opportunity for hockey teams to get in practice. And so they came together as a community and they raised their taxes. And the tax had an automatic sunset once they raised the amount of money they needed. And in the Wasilla case, as I mentioned before, revenues exceeded projections, so they were able to retire the tax a year earlier than they thought they would. And now they have a beautiful new sports center with a lot more ice time and a lot more opportunities for kids to be out playing hockey. So we see how popular these are in conservative communities. We know that we do live in a conservative community, and that the accountability and transparency of a temporary sales tax that goes into very dedicated projects, capital projects that you can see the results of, has a lot of traction. Lastly, what would our campaign look like? I know that really most of the parties here are interested in seeing what we can do to create new revenue as a community, but also want to see what's going to pass. Nobody wants to put something on the ballot that's going to be an embarrassment and crash and burn. Project 20s is supported by a very broad-based business coalition. Our supporters and funders at this time represent some of the largest employers in Anchorage. We really are speaking with the voice of the business community, and that's who's behind this because of the issues we have around attraction and retention of talent. If the BAC were to recommend this, or the Assembly to pick it up, adding Project 20s to the April 2020 ballot, our campaign is ready to immediately launch. We have $30,000 in the bank and significant additional commitments which will be realized once the initiative is on the ballot, so we are prepared to have a robust, strategic, and well-supported campaign from the very beginning. Over the last 6 months, one of the critical items that Project 20's team has been working on is meeting with business groups and trade associations to neutralize any organized opposition to the campaign. Now, we know there will always be people who are opposed to new taxes, and there will always be people who oppose, any kind of initiative like this, but we have been working with the business groups and the kind of usual suspects to try to prevent organized opposition from coming out. And our first television ad is complete, it's ready to air, and we have a 15-week campaign strategy and timeline in place. With that, I would love to show you our first ad. Maybe. It's showing on my computer, but not. Disconnect again. Okay. Disconnect from here. I'm glad you're my tech support.
You have to have a community. You have to have a community that employees want to live in, that people really are tied together for a bigger purpose, because that creates that sense of place.
Recruiting and getting the right people in my business. Say they're young, they're just a few years out of college, they're considering this as an option. The problem is that we haven't made the investments as a community to satisfy that audience. Project 20s is a temporary 3% sales tax to exclusively fund a dedicated set of needed capital projects that make our city better for doing business.
It takes investing dollars on a short-term basis to clean up some very basic things.
Companies want to invest in communities that invest in themselves. When I want my business to grow, when I want my business to succeed, I make investments in it. And the city's no different than that. If we want our city to be a good place, quite frankly, we need to spend money.
We're all going to have a more enjoyable place to work and live and play.
All right, that's all for me.
So since we're technically we're scheduled for an hour, but do folks on the BAC want to extend by 15 minutes so we can have a little bit of discussion and questions? Is anybody needing to check? Or can we do 15? Extend by 15 minutes? Is that all right?
Do we do a motion for that, or are we okay?
I think in this point, we'll just go for 15.
Let's just
We got it
go
on
for
the record.
There
Thank
we
you,
go. It's
Carla.
on the record.
Okay.
Yeah. So questions from our folks? Yes, Carla.
Thank you so much. That was a good presentation. I really like the thought of the Ford funding. My concern is that when you throw the homeless portion into it, that's an ongoing problem, doesn't seem to alleviate, seems to grow, but we're going to tell the community that, hey, you know, this is a temporary tax with these projects in it, and I don't know, I feel like that's kind of false. I also feel like if we say 5 years and it goes away, well, we all know that come 5 years from then, we'll either have to put another one in place for something else or even before that. So, I don't know, I do really like the idea of the Ford funding. I think that at least tells people that, you know, we're working towards this. I guess my fear is that, you know, when you throw something in there that's perpetual, how can we tell people it's a temporary thing?
So Project 20s is certainly not going to solve the homeless problem.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
And not intended to do that. But there are some capital needs with regards to homelessness. We certainly have a lack of shelter beds. We have a lack of substance abuse treatment beds. You know, these are some capital issues. They do come with operating expenses, and so part of the conversation is about how we, you know, as a community, want to be talking about operating expenses when it comes to homelessness, substance abuse, the ways in which those two interact. The opportunity here is to kind of forward fund or to front load, I guess, funding for projects that otherwise it might take 10 years for us to be able to build additional shelters or to build substance abuse treatment facilities. And not that we can solve it in 5 years, but that we can start by taking a big chunk out of the costs. I think that, you know, obviously something this body and the Assembly has to continue considering on an ongoing basis is how we fund the operating costs that come with having a large homeless problem. And our hope is that in some ways the Project 20s initiative is actually able to take certain types of operating costs away from the city. So, for example, doing a major citywide trails cleanup in one shot can really alleviate a lot of the issues that the police department and the fire department, frankly, are dealing with on a daily basis. And so we hope that in a way, frees up some of those resources from having to be, you know, out cleaning up homeless encampments, abating.
That's what I'm saying, it's perpetual.
It is perpetual. And homelessness is, I'm not an expert on homelessness. There are very few of them in the world, and I've not seen a single person solve homelessness. So we don't think that we will, but we think we can really help, and that it would also be kind of almost comical to raise $400 million in this community and not do something about what people view as the most pressing problem that we face. That to raise this money and to be investing in capital projects, but then to just not do anything about the homeless problem. I live in South Addition. I live right along the trail system. That's pretty much the number one thing I hear in my neighborhood is about homelessness. So I think it would be a hard sell if we weren't going to do anything to address that problem.
I think it's going to be a harder sell if you do, honestly.
Other questions?
I got a question. Thanks for the presentation, Moira. I know that your website lists that some of these projects were kind of pulled from comprehensive plans and neighborhood plans, but could you talk maybe a little bit more about how you settled on these specific projects and maybe also a little bit about what your coalition of other partners looks like?
Yes, great question. So our coalition is, you know, we have a campaign advisory committee that is made up of you know, the folks that you saw in the video, as well as some other business leaders in the community. And the way that those projects were ultimately decided was a 6-month process of really small focus groups around the community, hundreds of people that we met with since May of this year, everybody from community council leaderships to nonprofits to folks in government and state and city government to figure out which of these projects we want to really prioritize. There's no perfect way to spend $400 million in Anchorage, and I think there's 300,000 people in the city and probably 300,000 opinions on how you might spend that money. Each one of these projects comes from an existing plan, as you mentioned, so either the downtown comp plan or Ship Creek redevelopment, or as far back as Anchorage 2020. All of these things have actually already been scoped out and talked about and gone through community vetting processes, and that's why they made it to the top of the list, is because we wanted to have projects that have already been a part of our community mindset for, in some cases, 20 or 30 years that we've been talking about Ship Creek. So in vetting the projects, it was about which ones are realistic and would actually fit under this budget. It would be great to revitalize, it'd be great to restructure the port, but we couldn't raise enough money, even in 10 years, to probably do that. And then, which ones are the most pressing problems, like the Hillside and Eagle River fire issues. Feasibility and urgency, I'd say, were the two biggest criteria.
Mr. Rivera, you look like you've got something to say. Why don't you?
I do, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being out of order at a committee meeting that started at 1 p.m. downstairs that I'm late for. I really want to thank the administration for their presentation and then Moira for her presentation. And I really hope that the Budget Advisory Commission will look into this Project 20s and will look into it both to see if it's realistic and also to look at it at an equity lens to see if, I heard downtown a lot, and I appreciate that, and the assembly members all recognize and all have voted in such a way that we recognize the importance of downtown, but I really want to make sure that there's a fair equity lens put on this to see if sort of all of the municipality would benefit from this. And then also just want to state that, timeline-wise, the assembly only has until January 28th to put anything on the ballot. This did get on the agenda for this upcoming Tuesday, 17th, and I haven't.
Sorry, you said it did get on the agenda?
It did not. No, and I haven't heard of any assembly member that is crafting this to get on the agenda for the 14th. And just knowing my colleagues, it's very hard for me to imagine that between the 14th and the 28th, we're going to have the type of robust discussion that we need to actually approve this to be on the ballot. So there's this very sensitive time consideration there. But I really hope that the Budget Advisory Commission will look into this.
Thank you.
Thank you
for speaking up. Let's see, I want to have
I just have one
questions from the group first. Yeah.
Just how did Oklahoma handle the operating costs?
Of administering the tax?
No, of running the stadium, for example.
It ended up getting built into their regular operating budget, so they actually absorbed those costs.
Gotcha. And so is that kind of what you're anticipating here?
Most of these would not come with significant operating costs. We're not looking at building a Sullivan Arena or an Egan Center, so it's not coming with facilities operating costs. Some of them actually offset themselves. So in the case of the winter sidewalks, putting in heated sidewalks can over time actually reduce operating costs from having to shovel or plow sidewalks all through the winter. So what we've been looking at is ways in which any additional operating costs are actually offset.
Okay. And have you contemplated overfunding it to the point where you could have a fund that is designated for the operating costs associated with these individual projects at all?
That's kind of where the 10% maintenance fund came in. Certainly for major things, I think about the Lusac Library right now, which needs major renovations, and they're having to bond yet again for those projects because there wasn't money built into it. So certainly for large operating costs like that, I think that's a component. But we did discuss and are open to the discussion of putting some of that funding into an operating fund, something that spins off money every year. That's a strong possibility.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm Daniel, City Treasurer. I'm supposed to be on another meeting at 1:15, so that's why I was hoping to chime in. We just so you know, we heard about this just a couple weeks ago for the very first time. When I look at some of the details up on the website, it talks about approval in April and this tax starts getting collected in June. That's completely not possible. It's just way too complicated to ramp up not only on the city side but also on the business side. Just two other points is a lot of communities that have done sort of an add-on capital tax, and I can definitely see the logic in all that. They had established sales taxes already. So the rules, the system, everything have been in place for decades. Okay, Anchorage
much different model to have to go develop. The third thing is, when we looked at Oklahoma City, I know that was a major example, it talks about sales tax in sort of their headline discussion. But if you look at their local code and state code, it's actually an excise tax. And it's a tax on the gross receipts of the business. That is a very different tax than a general sales tax. That means it's a liability of the business, not of the individual consumers that buy items, in point of sale type. So I just want to make sure it's clear as to what type of tax we're talking about. Oklahoma City is not a general sales tax; it's something different than that.
Thank you. That was a
I do need to go.
good
Yeah, thanks for
clarification.
that. I just really quickly wanted to say on the implementation side, we do know that the dates are would be further back. And I'm sorry you're just hearing that out. We've been working with Bill Falsey and Jason Bach and staff for months on this, so just making sure that all that communication happens. But we really appreciate your feedback.
Thank you. Let's see, what other discussion comments that we have?
I had a couple other questions. You mentioned MLP, and I know that one of the things that the Assembly is discussing is taking some of the proceeds from that MLP sale and putting them toward treatment facilities. Does that at all overlap or interact with your plan at all? Have you looked into that?
It would definitely interact, and that was a recent enough decision that we want to look at ways and are open to talking about ways in which those interact effectively. So whether some of that goes towards capital and some of it goes towards operating, or if there's a way to forward fund operating costs to Connell's point, I think that would be an effective way to combine those resources.
So Moira, thanks again for coming. Huge. This is a really. I love there's a lot of strength to the vision here and a lot of bold thinking. And I really appreciate that. As far as a strategy going forward, it has to get onto this has to get into an ordinance that would for it to get into the April ballot. And according from what Mr. Rivera says, that might be that may be challenging. If it could not go ahead in this current ballot cycle, is that something that are you prepared for that? Is there a plan B, or can you pivot and continue to work on this until the next go around, or what is your take on that?
We don't have a plan B because right now the urgency of this is we absolutely have to do something now, and doing this in a mayoral election year would be pretty catastrophic. Nobody is going to run for mayor supporting new taxes, I think. So we'd be looking at waiting another 2 years, and frankly, we've been waiting 20 years to do something like this. So we just haven't put that in place. However, we have retained a lawyer to help us to write the actual ordinance, and so we've made some pretty significant headway there, and we'll be prepared to put forward an actual drafted ordinance, and have also been in conversation with multiple Assembly members who are interested in sponsoring it. So we're not worried about having the legal language in place, nor having an Assembly sponsor. Of course, the time is also of the essence. There would need to be discussion on the 14th and a vote on the 28th in order for this to make it to the April ballot.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I guess I wanted to mention that there is an ordinance for introduction tomorrow night that's introduced by Mr. Dyson, Senator Dyson, and it's very similar to 3% general sales tax with revenue dedicated to certain purposes. So it's only fair to mention that here to the Commission to take a look at that while you consider Project 20's proposal. There's been similarities, but they're not similar at all, and I don't think Mr. Dyson has worked with the Project 20's initiative. But the Commission should take a look at this because it's already on the addendum for tomorrow night. It's AOG 19-156, and it should be available on the website now.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Proposals are very similar. The list of exemptions in Dyson's proposal are almost identical to the list of exemptions on the Project 20's website.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let me see. So I think we are out of time. So I don't think we can actually get any kind of public commentary. Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, is there any way we can get a hold of Mr. Dyson's amendment?
Yep, I just made a note to Lila to send it to you because it was placed on the addendum.
So we hadn't I didn't have like a perfect picture in my head, at least, of what we would do with all of this information, but it does seem like perhaps one thing we could do is, I didn't know if maybe in our first meeting of the year, or maybe if we had a resolution before that, maybe we could do a ranked prioritization of the different proposals that are out there. What has actually been introduced to the assembly? Do you know, Lance?
So on the addendum, as Mr. Gates was saying, I will send that to you. It's a proposed ordinance for a public safety sales tax measure, provide property tax relief. And
so that's Dyson's.
Yep, and it's AO 2019-156. And I think, maybe Mr. Bockelstead would know, I thought there was another one on for
The 5% alcohol.
5% alcohol
sales
tax.
tax is also,
So there's a 2% and a 5% proposed alcohol tax?
no, just the 5%.
Okay. Oh, so the 2% you presented.
That was just me giving
right.
numbers.
So
That
the
was
one
just,
that
the one that's
Dunbar
introduced is 5%.
And Davidson, okay, that's the okay. Good, thank you. So we may I don't know, we may need to devote some discussion at our next meeting to maybe what order or what prioritization our members might want to give to some of these different proposals. The ones from the mayor's office and Project 20s and what's been proposed to the assembly already.
I think given the timing, this ordinance that for Mr. Dyson will get introduced tonight. The first public hearing will be the 14th. They have to act on it by the 28th of January, because that's the last day the assembly has in order to put issues on the ballot. The 14th, so that's what's going on there. And if there, so we will send you all those measures. Your next meeting is January 9th.
Mm-hmm.
So don't think there's an opportunity to meet before then, but we will send those to you, and we can dedicate that meeting of the 9th to talk about these proposals. And then you do have some time to get some information to the assembly.
So
And I believe that the assembly has a work session scheduled on the alcohol tax for January the 10th.
Okay. Good.
I'm not.
So one thing also is I had asked Jed to invite Tiffany Hall to be present, and I know we didn't get to any comments, but I was wondering if you had maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, if you wanted to say anything about the proposed tax, or if, because we invited you, I know I was just feeling like you may have wanted to have something to say. If
I am also fine just submitting something in writing that talks about ours and that we're over today. I was going to come before I heard from Jed anyways. Just to say that we have been working on the alcohol tax since the last one didn't pass, and have a lot of polling numbers that show people are in favor of the tax. We have some ideas that we'll be working through at the work session on the 10th that talk about exactly where those would be dedicated, but the way we chose where the funds would be dedicated is through public polling that we've been doing, and a lot of the costs would be more on the operating side because there is so much capital funding that just, especially for homelessness and for substance misuse treatment, that got put in for capital costs, so a lot of ours would be more towards operating costs. But happy to send that something tonight as well.
Very good. We appreciate that very much. I think with that we're out of time, and probably need to hear a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Seconded.
All right. And no opposition, and I think we're done here. And thanks everybody, and thanks to the speakers.
Thank you.
Jason and
Nice presentation. It's good.